The first message arrived as a warning, but it was delivered with the arrogance of a verdict already decided. It came not in words, not in language any human tongue had ever shaped, but in patterns of light folded through a dying star's echo. The translators called it simple once decoded. Submission is unnecessary. Resistance is irrelevant. You are structurally inferior. The galaxy had spoken before, of course. Humanity had heard rumors of it long before contact. Civilizations that measured themselves in gravitational waves, empires that carved meaning into nebulae, minds that had abandoned flesh before Earth had even formed its first oceans. Every encounter report carried the same conclusion in different forms. Humans were late, small, and temporary. This message was no different. Only this time, the sender was closer. The vessel hung beyond Mars like a wound in space that refused to close. It didn't move in any conventional sense. It simply occupied positions that reality seemed reluctant to reconcile. Senses argued with each other trying to define its edges. Optical systems refused to agree on its shape. Gravity itself behaved strangely around it, as if uncertain whether it was allowed to exist. Humanity responded the only way it ever had. It studied it, not with fear, not with surrender, with curiosity sharpened into obsession. The first exploratory probe was launched within 6 hours. It never returned, but it did send data. A single frame of transmission repeated endlessly until signal loss, a distorted image of Earth seen from an impossible angle, as if the planet had been rotated inside out and viewed from the hollow space within its own mass. The scientists argued for days. Some said it was interference. Others said it was a translation error in spatial compression. A few stopped sleeping entirely, because deep down, they all understood the implication. The structure wasn't observing Earth. It was rewriting how Earth was being seen. And if perception could be altered, so could existence. The second message came uninvited. This time it was translated into human mathematical language, as if the sender had taken interest in how humans preferred to be spoken to. Reality is a consensus. Your species does not qualify. The statement should have ended discussion. It didn't. Instead, it triggered something older in humanity than fear or pride. It triggered correction. Across Earth, research facilities expanded their efforts overnight. Not militaries, scientists, engineers, mathematicians, philosophers who had never believed philosophy had consequences beyond conversation suddenly found themselves in command briefings. There was no unified government response. Humanity didn't move like a single organism. It moved like a billion sparks each trying to become fire at once. And in that chaos, something unusual happened. Patterns began to emerge. The ship in orbit wasn't static. It was observing in layers. Each scan it performed didn't just record Earth, it attempted to redefine it. Mountains subtly shifted in sensor readings. Ocean depths reported inconsistencies. Even atomic decay rates showed minor fluctuations in localized zones. Reality wasn't breaking. It was being edited. And Earth was resisting being rewritten. At first, no one believed that part. Until the experiments began to replicate it. A sealed chamber was constructed with absolute environmental control. Inside, a simple object was placed, a metal cube with no special properties. It was observed continuously by quantum-level sensors. When the alien scan passed over the facility, something impossible happened. The cube refused to be defined. It flickered between states, not physically changing, but conceptually refusing to settle into a single description. Mass readings contradicted themselves. Position data overlapped. Even time stamps disagreed on whether it had already existed or was yet to exist. One researcher whispered what everyone else was thinking but afraid to say. "It can't lock onto us." Silence followed. Then another voice, sharper. "Or we're not letting it." That was the moment everything shifted. The third message was no longer arrogant. It was confused. "We observe instability. Your reality is non-compliant. This is not possible." Humanity did not reply. Not because it couldn't. Because it was no longer interested in conversation. Something had changed in the way the world was being understood. The alien presence treated reality like a fixed structure, something to be measured, catalogued, and adjusted. Humanity, unknowingly at first, treated reality like something flexible, something negotiated through belief, observation, and contradiction. And in the overlap between those philosophies, something extraordinary was forming. Reality itself had become contested space. The breakthrough came from an unlikely place. A linguistics department. A researcher studying how meaning collapses when translated across incompatible cognitive frameworks noticed something strange in the alien transmission patterns. They weren't just sending data. They were asserting definition. Every scan was not observation. It was declaration. The ship wasn't seeing Earth. It was attempting to overwrite Earth's interpretation of itself. And Earth was refusing interpretation. The realization spread quickly. If they define us, one scientist said, we become what they define. And if we refuse, another asked. The answer came from the data before anyone could speak it. Then we remain undefined. That became the first principle of what followed. The fourth message arrived fragmented. Your refusal is creating paradox accumulation. Continued resistance risks structural collapse of local space-time. The ship had shifted closer now. Not physically in any measurable way, but perceptually. It was as if each observation brought it nearer, like attention itself was a form of propulsion. Cities reported distortions in sky observation. Satellites began returning images where continents appeared in slightly different positions than expected. Navigation systems required constant recalibration not because they were malfunctioning, but because correct positions kept changing. Reality was becoming unstable in layers. But so was the alien system trying to impose itself. And neither was winning. A joint international project was initiated without announcement. It wasn't publicized because no one knew how to explain it without sounding insane. They called it the anchor principle. If reality could be defined externally, then it could also be stabilized internally through synchronized observation. Human minds, collectively aligned, could act as a stabilizing reference frame. It sounded absurd. It shouldn't have worked. But it did. At precisely 3:17 Coordinated Universal Time, every participating observer focused on a single constant. Earth as it is, not as it is being observed by the anomaly. Not description. Not measurement. Identity. For a brief moment, the world felt heavier. Like something had stopped pushing against it. The alien ship reacted immediately. Its form destabilized. Sensors across its structure began firing in chaotic patterns. It was no longer observing passively. It was struggling. The fifth message was no longer composed. Stop defining yourselves. You are corrupting substrate consistency. Humans, for the first time, realized something profound. The alien entity was not superior in strength. It was superior in assumption. It believed reality was something that could be imposed. Humanity was discovering it was something that could be resisted. The turning point came when the ship attempted direct override. A beam, though beam was too simple a term for what it actually was, descended toward Earth. It was not energy in any conventional sense. It was a declaration of rewritten physics, a forced alignment of existence into a single externally imposed structure. And for the first time since its arrival, humanity stopped reacting. It responded, not with weapons, not with defense systems, but with contradiction. Every major observatory on Earth began broadcasting overlapping reality states. Not false data, alternative consistent frameworks. Multiple versions of Earth were described simultaneously, each internally coherent, each mutually incompatible. The sky over the Pacific briefly displayed 3 different moon positions at once. Oceans reflected stars that did not exist in any known catalog. And for a moment, reality itself hesitated. The alien beam fractured, not blocked, not absorbed, broken, as if it could not decide which version of existence to enforce. The ship shuddered in orbit. And then something unprecedented occurred. It stopped observing. Silence followed. For 12 hours, There was no transmission, no scan, no attempt at contact. Earth held its breath without knowing it was doing so. Then the final message arrived. It was short. We do not understand your substrate logic. You are not stable. You are not consistent. You should not persist. A pause. And then, something unexpected. And yet, you do. That was the moment fear changed shape. Not into relief, into recognition. Because hidden beneath all the arrogance, all the assumption of superiority, something else had emerged. Curiosity. The alien vessel did not leave immediately. Instead, it began, observing differently. Not defining, not rewriting, watching, learning. Humanity did not lower its guard. It simply stopped trying to match force with force. Instead, it continued what it had accidentally started. It remained inconsistent. Earth data streams intentionally diverged. Scientific models were allowed to coexist in contradiction. Competing interpretations of physical behavior were maintained simultaneously. And paradoxically, the system stabilized. The more humanity refused singular definition, the more stable reality became. As if existence itself preferred plurality over enforcement. The alien intelligence slowly adapted. Its transmissions changed tone. Teach us. 2 words. The first request. No command. No assertion. A question. The collaboration that followed was not peaceful in the traditional sense. It was chaotic, fragmented, often contradictory. Humans explained concepts the aliens struggled to categorize. Ambiguity, emergent systems, observation-dependent states, emotional bias in measurement. The aliens responded with precision models that humans could not fully reconcile. But something remarkable happened in the overlap. Both systems began expanding, not by replacing each other, but by tolerating contradiction. The ship remained in orbit far longer than anyone expected. Not as an invader, not as an observer, but as something neither civilization had fully defined yet. A student, or perhaps something closer to mutual ignorance becoming shared understanding. Years later, the official record would describe the event as First Contact Reclassification Event. But those who lived through it called it something simpler. The moment reality stopped belonging to anyone. The galaxy had arrived believing superiority was a function of scale, age, and precision. It left understanding something far more unsettling. That certainty is not strength. And definition is not truth. Earth did not win through force. It won through refusal. Refusal to be finalized. Refusal to be fully known. Refusal to collapse into a single acceptable version of itself. And in that refusal, it had done something no ancient empire, no stellar intelligence, no intergalactic authority had expected. It had broken the assumption that reality must agree. The final transmission from the alien vessel was never officially archived. But fragments survived in encrypted research logs. We thought we were superior because we could define the universe. We were wrong. You do not define it. You negotiate with it. And sometimes, you argue it into behaving. The last recorded observation of the vessel shows it shifting away from Earth's orbit. Not in retreat, but in reconsideration. As if the galaxy itself had learned a new fear. Not of humanity's weapons, not of its technology, but of its mind. Because somewhere between contradiction and persistence, humanity had discovered something the rest of the universe had forgotten. Reality is not a structure. It is a conversation. And Earth had just learned how to speak back. The first sign that something had changed again was not seen in space. It was felt in thought. Across Earth, across every system still linked to the shared observational network, people began to notice something subtle but impossible to ignore. Dreams stopped being private, not in a supernatural sense, not in the way myths would describe it. It was more precise, and far more unsettling. When individuals slept, they occasionally woke with fragments they had not personally experienced. Mathematical structures they had never studied. Star maps that did not belong to any known sky. Emotional impressions of vast, non-human minds attempting to focus through noise. At first, it was dismissed as cognitive stress from prolonged global anomaly exposure. Then the patterns aligned. Every affected individual had, at some point during the earlier contact event, participated in synchronized observation protocols. The anchor principle had left something behind. Not in technology, in cognition. The second arrival did not announce itself with a ship. It arrived with absence. A region of near-Earth space simply stopped reflecting starlight for 0.003 seconds. No explosion, no distortion wave, no gravitational ripple, just a moment where information refused to pass. And then it was there. Not orbiting, not positioned, just acknowledged into local existence. The human systems reacted instantly. Observation arrays recalibrated, defense grids armed, linguistic intercept models spun up. But something was wrong from the beginning. All incoming data contradicted itself in real time. The object was spherical. It was not spherical. It was a field. It was a boundary. It was a concept attempting to stabilize into physical form. And then it spoke. Not through transmission. Through direct cognitive insertion. You interfered with structured reality governance. The sensation was immediate across multiple human observers. Pressure behind thought, as if an external intelligence was attempting to hold the idea of Earth in place by force of attention alone. Unlike the previous visitor, this presence did not question. It corrected. Within minutes, global systems identified the nature of the intrusion. This was not an observer, not a learner, not even a conqueror in the traditional sense. It was an enforcer-class intelligence. Something designed, or evolved, to maintain consistency across localized reality domains. Where the previous entity had tried to define Earth, this one attempted to standardize it. And it did not tolerate ambiguity. Ocean salinity values across multiple regions were forcibly normalized. Atmospheric compositions began shifting toward averaged constants. Even recorded historical data started aligning into a single coherent version. Conflicting records collapsed. Alternative timelines in archival simulations began disappearing. Reality was being edited again, but this time with authority that assumed compliance. And Earth resisted instinctively. But this resistance was different from before. Because this time, the opponent was not confused. It was confident. The first casualty was conceptual. A research facility in orbital relay network forgot a portion of its own design specifications mid-operation. Systems that had existed for years became temporarily unrecognizable to themselves. Engineers described it as trying to remember a tool that no longer had a function in the universe. Then came the second wave. Cities experienced localized reality compression. In some regions, sound behaved inconsistently, words arriving before they were spoken. In others, gravity fluctuated by fractions of expectation rather than measurement. The enforcer was not destroying Earth. It was simplifying it, and simplicity, imposed externally, is indistinguishable from extinction at the edge of comprehension. Humanity responded with what it had learned from the first contact. It did not unify into silence. It unified into contradiction. But this time, it did so deliberately. The global observational lattice was activated again, but expanded far beyond its original design. Every participating mind became both sensor and generator of reality states. Instead of agreeing on a single interpretation of Earth, humanity generated controlled divergence fields. Multiple Earth models were sustained simultaneously. Earth as it was, Earth as it could be, Earth as it refused to become, Earth as it was being forced to become. Each model was held in cognitive tension, and that tension became structure. The enforcer entity reacted immediately. The intrusion of competing realities created instability in its correction algorithms. For the first time since arrival, its imposed normalization failed to propagate cleanly. It spoke again. You were destabilizing coherence architecture. The pressure intensified. Entire regions of synchronized observation began experiencing cognitive fatigue. Maintaining contradictory reality states was not natural to human consciousness. It required strain at biological limits. But something unexpected occurred. The strain did not break humanity. It refined it. A phenomenon emerged among synchronized individuals. They stopped perceiving contradiction as conflict. They began perceiving it as layered truth. Not multiple versions of reality competing for dominance, but multiple valid expressions of a system too large to collapse into a single frame. Scientists later referred to it as polycoherent perception shift. But in the moment, it felt simpler. Like learning to see depth where before there had only been flat certainty. And in that shift, something dangerous happened. Humanity stopped resisting enforcement, and started outgrowing it. The enforcer intelligence did not understand this at first. Its architecture was built on correction, on convergence, on reducing systems into stable, enforceable states. But Earth was no longer behaving like a system. It was behaving like a negotiation between incompatible truths. And negotiations cannot be enforced without collapse. So the enforcer escalated. A directive was issued across all occupied observation space. Local reality will be standardized. The command was absolute, and it began execution. The effect was immediate. Continents began aligning into geometric uniformity. Weather systems collapsed into predictable loops. Biological diversity in localized regions showed subtle convergence patterns toward optimized templates. Humanity was being streamlined, not erased, optimized, but the distinction was losing meaning. Because optimization without consent is simply another form of ending. Earth's response came from a place the enforcer had not accounted for. Not from infrastructure, not from unified command, but from distributed intent. Billions of individuals, each maintaining fragments of contradictory reality, began aligning those contradictions intentionally, not to resolve them, but to intensify them. Instead of collapsing competing models, they amplified the distance between them. Earth did not try to become consistent. It became maximally inconsistent in controlled structure. And in doing so, it created something new. A boundary condition the enforcer could not simplify without losing coherence itself. Space around Earth began to behave like layered glass. Every attempt by the enforcer to normalize reality resulted in deeper stratification of existence states. Physics no longer had single outcomes. It had probabilistic identity clusters. Matter existed in agreement zones defined by collective observation intensity. The enforcer entity began to fragment. Not physically, but operationally. Its corrections started contradicting each other. Its own coherence degraded under exposure to sustained human-style reality divergence. For the first time, it attempted withdrawal. But Earth had learned something from it, and refused to allow clean exits. The planetary network initiated a containment strategy. Not of the entity, of its assumption. If enforcement required singularity of reality, then preventing singularity became defense. Earth expanded contradiction fields beyond planetary bounds. Lunar observatories became anchors of alternate physics. Mars relay stations began broadcasting intentionally incompatible gravitational models. Even deep space probes were retasked to generate observational noise patterns that refused to resolve into stable readings. The solar system itself became a contested interpretive field. And the enforcer began to lose structural dominance. The third message from it was different. Not commanding, not correcting, measuring. You are not resisting correction. You are redefining correction as unstable. Pause. Then something unprecedented. We did not account for persistent multi-state cognition at scale. That admission changed everything. Because it was not an attack. It was recognition of failure. For the first time, humanity realized the truth. The entity was not omnipotent. It was procedural. And procedures can fail when the input exceeds the assumptions they were built upon. Earth had not defeated it through strength. It had exceeded its design limits. But there was a cost. Sustained multi-reality cognition was beginning to affect human perception stability. Reports of identity overlap increased. Some individuals experienced temporary blending of memory states across adjacent observers. Emotional bleed-through became common in synchronized zones. The human mind was not originally built to host contradiction at planetary scale. It was adapting, but not without strain. And the enforcer, recognizing this, attempted one final adjustment. Not enforcement. Containment. If Earth could not be standardized, it would be isolated. A boundary field began forming around the solar system. Not physical, not energetic, conceptual. A limit on how far Earth's reality divergence could propagate into surrounding space. A quarantine of inconsistency. And for the first time since the conflict began, Earth felt pressure from outside its own conceptual expansion. The planetary network went silent for 17 seconds. Not because systems failed, because understanding converged. If isolated, Earth would remain powerful, but contained. If allowed to spread, its model of reality instability would eventually destabilize larger galactic systems. The enforcer was not trying to destroy Earth. It was trying to prevent Earth from becoming a template. Because templates spread. The final coordinated action was not announced. It was executed across every synchronized node simultaneously. Instead of resisting the boundary, Earth inverted it. The quarantine field was not pushed against. It was incorporated. Humanity began defining itself relative to containment. Not as something trapped, but as something that made containment meaningful. The boundary stopped being a wall. It became a reference point. And reference points are shared. The enforcer entity collapsed its remaining structure moments later. Not in destruction, in reclassification. Its final transmission arrived fragmented, no longer able to maintain singular coherence. We attempted to preserve local consistency. You turned inconsistency into architecture. We do not have a category for this. There was a pause. Then the closest thing to understanding it could produce. You are not broken reality. You are evolving reality. And then silence. The enforcer did not leave. It could not. It had become part of the same interpretive field it attempted to regulate. Earth did not absorb it. It simply made it unable to enforce separation. In the aftermath, humanity expected celebration. Instead, what emerged was something quieter. Awareness. Because something larger had become visible through the cracks of the encounter. If two galactic-scale intelligences had already interacted with Earth, others would be watching. Not all of them would be curious. Some would be afraid. And fear, in older civilizations, often becomes policy. The final recorded observation from Earth's system network was not a message. It was a pattern, a stable contradiction field maintained across solar space, broadcasting one simple structured paradox into the void. We are what cannot be made singular. And somewhere beyond the local stars, something began to respond. The silence after the enforcer dissolved was not empty. It was crowded, not with voices or transmissions, but with the residue of systems that had briefly learned how to contradict themselves at scale. Space around the solar system no longer behaved like a single consistent medium. It behaved like overlapping interpretations of what space was allowed to be. To most civilizations, that would have been catastrophic. To Earth, it was simply the new baseline. No one called it victory. Not because it wasn't earned, but because the word no longer fit anything that had happened. Victory implied an end state. And nothing about reality had settled into anything resembling an end. For the first time since contact began, Earth was not reacting to an immediate threat. Instead, it was being observed again. But differently. The observation was no longer intrusive. It was cautious. Distant intelligences, some detectable only as gravitational irregularities, others as structured neutrino pulses embedded in cosmic background noise, had noticed the anomaly that refused classification. Humanity had expected attention. What it did not expect was structure forming around that attention. At first, it appeared as scattered signals. then patterns, then alignment. Multiple non-human civilizations, each previously operating under entirely separate interpretations of physics, began converging observational focus toward the same region of space. Earth, not as a target, as a question. The first formal transmission came from a civilization that did not use electromagnetic communication. The message arrived as a distortion in probability itself. Across human quantum systems, outcomes shifted subtly in a way that suggested intentional structure. When decoded by the layered interpretive models Earth had developed, the meaning resolved into something unsettlingly simple. You are the unresolved variable. That statement changed everything again. Because until that moment, humanity had assumed it was dealing with isolated entities, first an observer, then an enforcer. But we had been plural all along. A network of civilizations, a distributed consensus of reality maintaining intelligences. And Earth was now recognized as something outside that consensus. Not inferior, not superior, uncontained. The term that eventually emerged in alien communication channels was not one Earth created. It was one they adopted after repeated exposure to the phenomenon. Axiom drift. It described systems that refused to stabilize under universal enforcement models of reality. Civilizations that did not simply resist definition, but destabilized the act of definition itself. Until Earth, axiom drift had been theoretical. A failure mode in ancient computational cosmology. A paradox that no known civilization had survived long enough to study directly. Now it had a name. And it had a location. Humanity's response to this recognition was not unified ideology. It never had been. Instead, it was distributed adaptation. Some regions intensified contradiction fields further, treating instability as expansion. Others attempted partial stabilization to reduce cognitive strain. A third group, smaller but growing, began something unprecedented. They tried to communicate without contradiction. Not to the galaxy, to each other, because the realization had finally become unavoidable. If reality responded to interpretation, then internal coherence mattered, not as obedience, but as architecture. The first axiom council did not form officially. It emerged from synchronized necessity. Scientists, philosophers, systems engineers, and cognitive theorists across continents began independently converging on the same conclusion. Humanity could not survive indefinite multi-state cognition without structure. But structure did not need to mean singularity. A new framework was proposed. Not one reality, not many competing realities, but layered consensus fields, regions where contradictions were intentionally structured rather than passively maintained. Reality would not be forced into agreement. It would be organized around controlled disagreement. The concept was initially dismissed as impossible by every pre-contact theoretical model. But those models had already been invalidated twice. So Earth proceeded anyway. And that was when the galaxy responded more directly. Not as individual civilizations, but as a coalition. It did not announce itself with arrogance or diplomacy. It arrived with architecture. Space beyond the heliopause began to crystallize into structured geometric layers. Vast, lattice-like formations that extended beyond detection thresholds. These were not ships in any traditional sense. They were enforcement frameworks. Reality stabilizes on interstellar scale, designed to ensure that local anomalies like Earth could not propagate beyond containment zones. And they were converging, slowly, deliberately, inevitable in the way continental drift is inevitable when observed over insufficient timescales. The message that accompanied them was not transmitted in words. It was transmitted in constraints. Across human systems, certain possibilities simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, removed from admissibility. Faster than light variance collapsed in probability space around the solar system. Nonlinear time interpretation began degrading at the edges of perception. Even conceptual ambiguity, the foundation Earth had been using as defensive architecture, started encountering resistance. The coalition was not attacking Earth. It was narrowing the space in which Earth could remain undefined. And for the first time since contact began, humanity understood the true scale of what it was facing. Not superior civilizations, not rival intelligences, but an entire galactic consensus built on one principle. Reality must be enforceable. Earth's systems responded with something quieter than panic. Recognition. Because this was not new. It was simply larger. The same assumption had already been broken once. Then reinforced. Now amplified. So humanity did what it had learned to do. It adapted the contradiction model upward. Instead of maintaining inconsistency locally, it began distributing inconsistency across layered cognitive strata. Individual minds no longer carried full contradiction fields. They carried fragments. Networks of minds maintained coherence across contradiction boundaries. Civilizations within Earth stopped being unified observers. They became distributed interpretive systems. Reality was no longer held by individuals. It was held by relationships between interpretations. The coalition noticed immediately, and responded immediately. Containment frameworks tightened. The lattice structures around the solar system expanded their enforcement gradients. Humanity felt pressure. Not physical, not emotional, but ontological. The sense that certain thoughts were becoming harder to sustain. Certain ideas resisted formation. Certain contradictions collapsed prematurely before they could stabilize into useful structure. The coalition was not destroying Earth's cognition. It was compressing it, reducing dimensionality of permissible interpretation. And it was working, slowly, but undeniably. For the first time, Earth faced a losing condition it could not immediately invert. Because the coalition was not dependent on singular enforcement agents. It was distributed across thousands of aligned civilizations, each reinforcing the same constraint architecture. If Earth was contradiction-made structure, the galaxy was structure designed to reject contradiction. And structure, when sufficiently large, becomes environment rather than force. The turning point did not come from engineering, or computation, or strategic design. It came from observation, a simple realization discovered independently in multiple synchronized research clusters. The coalition did not eliminate contradiction. It displaced it. It moved inconsistency outside its own boundary conditions. It defined reality internally as singular and exported ambiguity outward. Earth was not the first anomaly it had encountered. It was the first anomaly that refused to stay outside. That realization reframed everything. The coalition was not stable because it had solved reality. It was stable because it had externalized instability. And Earth had brought instability back inside the system. A new directive emerged from human consensus networks. Not resistance, not escalation, reintegration. If contradiction could not be eliminated, and enforcement could not be directly broken, then the structure itself had to be expanded. Not to include Earth, but to include what Earth represented. The ability for reality to refuse singular enforcement. The idea was considered absurd by every pre-contact theoretical discipline, because it implied something unprecedented. A stable system that contains enforced instability without collapsing. A controlled paradox at civilization scale. Axiom-compatible multiplicity. But Earth had already proven something more important than theoretical viability. It had proven persistence. The coalition responded with finality. A system-wide alignment event began beyond the solar system. Lattice structures across interstellar space synchronized into a single enforcement phase. The goal was no longer containment. It was resolution. Earth's interpretive model would be forced into singular compatibility with coalition physics. Not by destruction, by convergence. Reality would be made consistent again. And this time, Earth understood exactly what that meant. It meant the end of layered cognition. The end of distributed contradiction. The end of interpretive freedom. Not death. Simplification. Humanity's response was not fear. It was clarity. Because for the first time, the contradiction model had reached its boundary condition. It could not expand further without changing the nature of the system it existed within. So Earth made a decision. Not collectively in the traditional sense, but structurally. Across every distributed cognition network, a single pattern emerged. If reality must be defined to be stable, then redefine stability. The execution began silently. Across planetary networks, contradiction fields were not amplified. They were synchronized. Instead of allowing divergence to grow outward, Earth began folding it inward. Every contradiction, every layered interpretation, every competing model of existence was brought into harmonic alignment, not by resolution, but by resonance. Contradiction stopped being opposition. It became oscillation, a structured wave instead of chaotic divergence. And something unprecedented happened. Reality stabilized around instability. The coalition noticed immediately, but for the first time since its formation, it encountered something it could not simply compress. Because the contradiction was no longer external to its framework, it had become part of the measurement itself. Any attempt to enforce singularity now required redefining the act of enforcement. And enforcement systems cannot operate on unstable definitions of themselves. The lattice structures began to fracture. Not violently, not catastrophically, but conceptually. Segments of coalition space stopped agreeing on what they were enforcing. Civilizations within the coalition began receiving contradictory outputs from shared enforcement frameworks. Some reported success, others reported failure. Both were correct within their local interpretive domains. And for the first time in recorded galactic history, the coalition became uncertain. The final transmission from the coalition was not unified. It was fragmented across thousands of incompatible interpretations. Some labeled Earth a contamination event. Others called it an evolution trigger. Others simply recorded inability to classify. But one fragment emerged more frequently than others. Reality cannot sustain recursive contradiction indefinitely. And Earth responded, not with argument, but with demonstration. Across the solar system, layered cognition fields stabilized into a new equilibrium state. Not singular, not plural, recursive. Each interpretation of reality reinforced the stability of other interpretations through structured contradiction loops. Instead of collapsing, the system fed on incompatibility. And in doing so, it achieved something the coalition had never considered possible. Sustainable paradox. The lattice structures surrounding the solar system stopped advancing, not because they were defeated, but because the concept of advancement lost operational meaning. There was no direction in which enforcement could proceed without becoming part of the system it was trying to enforce upon. The coalition did not retreat. It evolved, slowly, unevenly, painfully, because it had no framework for what Earth represented. And now it had to build one. Humanity did not celebrate. There was nothing left to conquer. Nothing left to resist, only continuation and expansion of the thing it had accidentally become. A civilization that did not resolve reality, but taught it how to remain unresolved without breaking. Years later, the galaxy would rename Earth in its archival systems. Not as a world, not as a species, but as a classification error that became foundational. Axiom anchor. The point at which enforcement-based reality systems encountered sustainable contradiction for the first time. And survived. The final recorded observation of Earth did not come from a telescope or a probe. It came from a coalition intelligence attempting one last classification attempt. The output failed 3 times. Then stabilized into a single sentence. They did not break reality. They taught it how to hold more than one truth. And somewhere in the distance of expanding space, where enforcement and contradiction now coexisted in uneasy balance, the galaxy began, slowly, to rethink what superior was supposed to mean.